good morning. Happy Wednesday. I hope that your day is off to a good start. Mine is so far. Obviously in my outdoor office, second cup of coffee, this time with a ship mug. Last week, I wasn't here live on Facebook, but I did pre-record, and it's on my YouTube channel. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. But I began what will actually take me some time, and that is to not every book of the Bible individually, but most of the time just taking small groups of books, small sections of them, and just sort of, giving background. Why was it written? Who was it written to? When was it written? Some of the issues with the content of it. And last week, I began with the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy. It's also called the Torah, Hebrew word for law. And that is, like I said, that's up on my YouTube channel. And this week, we just continue chronologically, and that's what, and maybe not chronologically, I should specify that I'm just going consecutively through the Bible. And the books of the Bible aren't necessarily in chronological order. Pardon the noise, a big truck without a muffler. So for today, if Genesis to Deuteronomy was last week, then today, obviously we are looking at Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Today we are looking at Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And last week, we left off, the Israelites are on the verge of crossing over into Jordan. They're on the verge of crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land. I didn't mention this last week, but if you remember your Old Testament well, you know that they got to the verge of the Promised Land at one point, and Moses sends 12 spies across, and there was a mixed report. 10 of them came back and they're scared to death. The people are like giants and we're just grasshoppers compared to them. But 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, came back and said, it's a land flowing with milk and honey, let's go. And Moses went with the majority report, and the result is wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. The Pentateuch leaves off with the Israelites on the precipice of the Jordan River. And that takes us into Joshua. Moses dies. He dies without having crossed the Jordan River. God lets him look across the river into the Promised Land. And he takes him up on Mount Nebo, where he can look to the northwest, across the river, and see the Promised Land, but he's not allowed to cross. That takes us to Joshua. So Joshua, the name of the book comes from the main character, not necessarily who wrote it. Joshua didn't write the book of Joshua. Joshua's named that because Joshua is the main character. It's entirely possible that portions of the book go back all the way to the time of Joshua, but there are numerous references to things that stand to this day. Monuments or structures that stand to this day, which lead us to think when we're reading it that this was written sometime later by somebody just describing what had happened at that earlier point. So like with a lot of books of the Bible, it's probably edited over some period of time. The content of the book is really about the conquest of the promised land, and the entrance of the Israelites into the promised land. And in that way, it is just a continuation of the story of the Exodus. It's a continuing story that begins in, say, Exodus 10, 11, 12, and following. One of the major themes of Joshua is the repeated statement from God, be strong and of good courage. Over and over and over again you see that. Be strong and of good courage as you are entering the promised land. There are two really interesting and challenging things about the book of Joshua. The first is this. There is a lot of stuff in Joshua, and really the same is going to be true in Judges as well. There's a lot of stuff that you don't want to be reading to a children's Sunday school class. Because in Joshua we see commands to lay waste to a city and kill every inhabitant, and that's tough. So one of the challenges interpretively is how do we deal with that? How do we interpret that? How do we reconcile that with the rest of what we know about the faith? The other thing is archaeological. How do we interpret the entrance of the Israelites into the promised land in light of archaeology? So those are two curious things, and I invite you to read more about them. Just depends on where your interest lies. Now that takes us into Judges. So if you read Joshua, you see the Israelites cross the Jordan River. The river is parted, just like the Red Sea was parted. We've all heard about the Battle of Jericho. That's in Joshua. The book of Judges is all about how the people settled the land. Just like Joshua, the book of Judges is anonymous. There is a later Hebrew tradition that Samuel wrote Judges, but that is a later Hebrew tradition, and so whether or not he actually had anything to do with the composition, who knows? It is really likely that Judges was compiled over a period of time, edited over a period of time, was probably finished by the time of David. As far as the time period for Judges, it follows immediately after the events of Joshua. Rough time frames, 1100s, 1200s. That tells us about the time frame for Joshua, say the 1300-ish BC. All these numbers are BC. So 1100s, 1200s, give or take a little bit, for the events of Judges. The book of Judges is a series of cycles. There are 12 judges, and this book is a series of cycles. It runs something like this. Things start off okay. The people fall into apostasy, worshiping idols, worshiping false gods. They begin to be oppressed by some other foreign power. God raises up a judge. And judge isn't, as we think about a judge, somebody with a robe and a gavel at a bench, but rather a judge in this case is sort of a military / religious leader. So People start off okay, they fall into apostasy, idolatry, they begin to be oppressed by some other foreign power, and then God raises up a judge. The judge comes along and delivers them, and the people repent, and they're good for a little while. They have some rest until they fall back into apostasy and idolatry. So you see this, it is a cycle. You read through Judges, you pick up on that. Things are good. Apostasy, idolatry. They're oppressed by some foreign power. God sends a judge who delivers them. Things are good. Apostasy, idolatry. That's the way it works. Read the book of Judges and you'll see that. Some of the judges are well known. Gideon, Samson, Deborah, Jephthah, and several others. One thing to point out is that the judges aren't necessarily paragons of virtue. They have their warts, and in some cases they are huge warts. They're not; these judges aren't necessarily righteous or virtuous. And the book of Judges ends this way. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So that is a clear indication that the book was written, at least that part of the book was written sometime later after the period of kings being there. And so in this way, Judges is sort of just beginning to lay the foundation, the groundwork for where there will be a king in Israel. Joshua, Judges, and then Ruth. So if you're thinking chronologically, this does follow chronologically. The author is unknown. The author is totally unknown, and the book is about Ruth. It was probably written sometime during the time of David, or maybe just after, because David's kingship is mentioned in Ruth chapter 4. And the events of the book of Ruth are in the generation or two before the rise of King David. In terms of the contents of the book, it's a beautiful story. It is a story of a woman named Ruth who follows her mother-in-law back to Bethlehem. Her mother-in-law is Naomi, and Naomi and her kin leave Bethlehem because of a drought. Naomi and her husband leave Bethlehem because of a drought, and in leaving to return back home, Ruth has a decision. Ruth's husband is dead. Naomi's husband is dead. There is nothing to call Ruth to go back to Bethlehem because she didn't come from there. But Ruth tells Naomi, "Your God shall be my God, your people shall be my people." And the two travel back to Bethlehem together. And while they are there, Boaz emerges as a kinsman redeemer for Ruth and marries her. And it's a beautiful story. It's not a particularly long book, but it's a beautiful story. Boaz rises up to be a kinsman redeemer for Ruth. Read your Old Testament to find out what that is. And he marries her. They have Obed. Obed is their son. Obed's son is Jesse. And one of Jesse's sons is King David. So Ruth and Boaz, would be essentially King David's great-grandparents. Read the book of Ruth. Anyway, with that, I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday. And next week, we move on into Samuel and Kings.